evening, everyone. I'm Chris Stover with the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, or CCEPA, and on behalf of our board and our executive director, Dr. Sheila Brown, and our founding institutions, the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University, I'd like to welcome you here this evening. Tonight is part 2 of CCEPA's Trust in Education series, which we bring to you in collaboration with the Learning Partnership. In part 2, we're going to look at the global campaign for Education for All. But before we get to that, we're going to have a brief look back at the ground we've covered so far in part 1. And to do that for us, we have David Napier, who is a Halifax-based, story-based consultant who is working with us at CCEPA to weave all four parts of the education series together. David's been writing pieces before and after each event, which we distribute, and they're also available on our website. Before each of the parts of this series, David will link for you what's come before to give context for the discussion that we'll have this evening. Before I leave the podium, I'd just like to ask you to find an evaluation sheet before you go. Jot down a few thoughts about what you think, because CCEPA does find your feedback valuable in the formation of future programming. And with that, I'd like you to help me extend a warm welcome to David Napier.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris said, my name is David Napier, and as she mentioned, I'm a writer in Halifax. I'm not a public speaker by any stretch. In fact, I thoroughly don't enjoy public speaking. And I was thinking on the way over here, I thought, well, I don't like public speaking. And I thought, well, it's not like I'm speaking in front of a man who's been knighted by the Queen. It could be worse. And I thought, well, no, actually, he has been knighted by the Queen. And I thought, well, nothing else could be worse than that. And I thought, well, I don't have my eyeglasses with me. So it actually did get worse and worse and worse. But as Chris says, I'm just, no, I'm fine. As Chris says, I'm here to sort of provide a bit of a link between the past session and the one we're going to have this evening. And having done, I'll just start off by saying, having done a lot of research and reading about Sir John Daniel, I think it's going to be a terrific event tonight. And a terrific speech. Dr. Paul Caplan spoke a few weeks ago, and he was speaking in the first of the Trust in Education series lectures, and he drew largely from his experience both with and his data from the Canadian Council on Learning. And in his address, and I'll crib from some notes that I made earlier, he was he's focused on a lot of interesting points, but 3 of them really popped from his address. And the first was that trust in education must be measured, and I'm quoting from him here, with regard to the performance of schools, but also more broadly with respect to society's success in promoting opportunities for continuous learning. And he cited, secondly, that accountability and transparency will improve and promote trust regardless of the level of performance of education systems at any particular point in time. Accountability and transparency do not emerge spontaneously. They must be nurtured, and we must create the conditions, voices, bodies that support them. And then thirdly, and finally, he said, the challenge of learning is much broader than school systems and much deeper than the provision of formal education. It involves the partly unconscious, but mainly conscious and planned adaptation of a geographical and economic entity to a knowledge society. It goes without saying that, as the old joke goes, you kind of had to be there, but that does give you a sense of what he was talking about. And there was actually a very lively question and answer period afterwards, and very broad-ranging and interesting as well. And Dr. Caplan, I'm only going to speak for another minute or so, but he draws heavily on and bases much of his work, as I believe Sir John does, on the 4 pillars of learning, those being to know, to do, to live together, and learning to be. And those in turn, if I can use sort of the Russian doll approach to telling a bit of a story about what we've heard and what we're going to hear, that's sort of the doll within that doll is a report by Jacques Delors to Unesco, in which he identified those 4 pillars of learning, and his report was entitled "Learning the Treasure Within." And I think we're very lucky to have Sir John Daniel here tonight, and he's going to sort of help us explore a little further the treasure within that is learning. And in order to properly introduce Sir John Daniel, I'll turn the podium over to Dr. Sheila Brown.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that overview. When we set up this series, the program committee of CCEPA thought it was very important that we weave together the sessions so that those who are not able to come to any one might still be able to have the big picture. And certainly at the end of this series, we hope to be able to make perhaps a publication or some web-based material available so that people can benefit from everything that happens in this series. It's my great pleasure now to more formally introduce Sir John Daniel to you. And since 2004, he has been the president of the Commonwealth of Learning. And for those of you who are not that familiar with the Commonwealth of Learning, it is a Commonwealth agency that emphasizes the role of technology in expanding the scope and the scale of learning. So there's a particular emphasis on open and distance learning, an opportunity to use technology to reach individuals who might otherwise not have access to education. And Sir John came to that position after a very distinguished career that has taken him to various parts of the globe. He was born in the UK and obtained his initial university education at Oxford University in metallurgy, and then went on to study in Paris. And along the way, he started to practice what he preached and became a lifelong learner himself, taking a number of years to complete, on a part-time basis, a master's degree in educational technology at Concordia University. He has held appointments in a number of Canadian institutions, culminating in the presidency of Laurentian University in Sudbury in Ontario, a position which he held from 1984 to 1990. And then the UK beckoned again, and he went back across the Atlantic and became the Vice Chancellor of the Open University at a time of enormous growth for the Open University, and again, a mandate to provide access to education for individuals who might not otherwise have that opportunity. From there, Sir John took the position of Assistant Director General for Education with UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Cultural Organization, and made a distinguished contribution there before being lured away to the west coast of Canada to head up the Commonwealth of Learning. And of course, even though that's where the offices are, as you might expect, he doesn't get to spend a lot of time in Vancouver, because by its very nature, the head of the Commonwealth of Learning is constantly traveling to meet people in the countries of the Commonwealth. Sir John has been knighted by the Queen for services to education, and as well as the recipient of many honorary degrees and other honors from around the globe. He certainly is renowned not only as an administrator, but also a scholar, and his book, Mega Universities and Knowledge Media, Technology Strategies for Higher Education, is a well-known work in the field. So we are delighted to welcome him to Halifax to give the second presentation in our Trust In series. And as you've heard from my colleague Chris Stover, Sir John's title is Success and Failure in the Global Campaign for Education for All. What now? So I invite you to join with me in welcoming a most distinguished scholar and educator to the podium, Sir John Daniel. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for that generous introduction where you slipped over the more embarrassing bit. She said I took a number of years to achieve a master's degree in educational technology. In fact, it took me 25 years. But this was most helpful when I was at the Open University because on shaking hands with students at graduation, they would often complain how long it had taken them. And I'd say, how long? And often it was sort of 8-10 years because this was a part-time operation. And I'd say, well, I can beat that. I took 25. But it is a delight to find that your President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Colin Dodds, is a graduate of the Open University. It's an unbelievable institution. And one of the remarkable things about it, because it is so large and has such a large footprint, if you like, you can almost never address an audience anywhere in the world where there isn't someone who has some contact with this institution. Anyway, I was going to begin by saying now for something completely different. It's not completely different, but you've been hearing in this series so far about education in Canada with a focus on the notion of trust. But this evening I'm going to put on the wide-angle lens and look at education in the world with a focus on international cooperation, which is a rather important manifestation of trust in this era of globalization. So my title, as you've heard, is Success and Failure in the Global Campaign for Education, What Now? Let me say what a pleasure it is to be here. I live in Vancouver, and it's always salutary to traverse this huge and extraordinary country of ours, amare usque ad mare, from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And this is the month of March, but nevertheless, I left Vancouver in the snow, and I've arrived at Halifax in the snow, so this is definitely Canada. But you might be interested to know that decisions made here in Halifax in the year 2000 are still a major influence on my work. The Commonwealth of Learning, which I head, reports to the Commonwealth Ministers of Education, who meet in conference every 3 years. And in the year 2000, they met here in Halifax, and in that millennium year, two rather contrasting trends converged. The largest gathering of heads of government ever assembled at the United Nations had made a commitment to eradicate global poverty by agreeing the Millennium Development Goals. So there was a strong focus on development, and I'll return to that. But in that same year, the dot-com frenzy swept the world. Profits and IT vendors vied with each other to declare that all education would soon take place on a computer screen and that traditional methods of teaching and learning were headed for the dustbin of history. Now, the convergence of these two trends, a stress on education expansion and the dot-com frenzy, was particularly challenging for the 32 small states of the Commonwealth, with populations of 2 million or less, often much less, that constitute 2/3 of the Commonwealth membership. The ministers from these small states felt that they did not have the critical mass of people, equipment, or expertise to punch their weight in the new e-world. And they decided to crack the challenge by aggregating their efforts as small states and working together. And they decided to create the virtual university for small states of the Commonwealth as a network for collaboration between them, and they asked the Commonwealth of Learning to help them. And I'm proud to say that when we shall meet the ministers again in June at their triennial conference in Kuala Lumpur, 9 years after the Halifax decision, we can report significant success. Hundreds of government officials and staff members of tertiary institutions in these small states have been trained in advanced ICT skills. And here is a cross-section of people from a number of small states at a 3-week workshop in Mauritius to develop courses in entrepreneurship and tourism. Because they are scattered all over the globe, we've also developed a new transnational qualifications framework to facilitate course sharing, so that e-courses, as they become internationally available from tertiary institutions in these small states, all over the globe can be available on a common portal, and the people in the Caribbean can see where the course from Samoa fits into their own qualification structure. But this evening I'm going to be talking not about tertiary education, but about basic education. In that same millennium year, 2000, UN agencies convened over 1,000 people, including representatives of 164 countries and over 100 NGOs, to a world forum in Dakar, Senegal. It agreed a set of objectives and a campaign for achieving education for all, which I shall refer to as EFA. But before I tell the story of that campaign, I want to go further back into history and to ask why we consider this goal of education for all so important. I'm sure this audience takes it for granted, but historically the world's rulers have not in general attached much importance to education, either for others or for themselves. Having some trained doctors, lawyers and priests was obviously a good thing, but most would have agreed with Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis, who remarked in the middle of the last century that too much education was bad for the people. How different from the tone of President Barack Obama's first major speech on education that he delivered yesterday. He laid into the shibboleths that have led to the steady deterioration of America's schools and laid out measures to secure quality education for all Americans. So my plan this evening is to sketch the history of the idea of education for all, to tell the story of the international campaign to achieve it, to note the major successes and failures of the campaign, and finally to suggest some answers to the challenges that success and failure pose. So why is education for all so important? 2 centuries ago, in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argued for universal education on the grounds of public order and the preservation of freedom. And I quote, "The more ordinary people are instructed, the less liable they are to the delusions of enthusiasm and superstition, which among ignorant nations frequently occasion the most dreadful disorders. An instructed and intelligent people, besides, are always more decent and orderly than an ignorant and stupid one. They are more disposed to examine and more capable of seeing through the interested complaints of faction and sedition, and they are, upon that account, less apt to be misled into any wanton or unnecessary opposition to the measures of government. In free countries where the safety of government depends very much upon the favourable judgment which the people may form of its conduct, it must surely be of the highest importance that they should not be disposed to judge rashly or capriciously concerning it." I think that is very nicely put, and I particularly like the phrase about the delusions of enthusiasm, something to remember the next time you mouth standard cliché that you are very excited about something. And of course, this statement is a very good fit to Canada. Adam Smith would have readily signed up to our national aspiration of peace, order, and good government. And dare I suggest that the difference between Canada's education system, keyed to that sober aspiration, and that of the US, linked to the more flamboyant ambitions of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is the fundamental reason why, in the present financial crisis, Canada's banking system has largely avoided the debacle south of the border. Now go fast forward from Adam Smith to the middle of the 20th century. By then, access to education had come to be seen as a human right, and it was incorporated into international law through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26, passed by the UN General Assembly, which said, "Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free at least in the fundamental and elementary stages, elementary education shall be compulsory, technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. I don't think that statement needs any commentary, but since Adam Smith is sometimes thought of as the father of capitalism and privatization, let me remind you that he also said, for a very small expense, the public can facilitate, can encourage, and can even impose on almost the whole body of the people the necessity of acquiring those most essential parts of education, which is a nice endorsement of the public duty to facilitate education for all. If we move forward again to the late 20th century, we find that the focus of arguments justifying universal education had acquired an economic spin. Bodies like the World Bank began to talk about human capital development. Now, scholars have since reviewed carefully the relationships between economic development and a number of measures of educational expansion. Having found little correlation between economic growth and the expansion of primary education, they examined claims for a stronger correlation with the expansion of secondary enrollment, but showed that this did not hold up either. William Easterly concluded that education is yet another magic formula that has failed us on the quest for growth. But at the turn of the century, the development economist and Nobel laureate Amartya Sen urged a more holistic perspective for the role of education in development. For him, the search for a single magic bullet that would destroy poverty and create steady economic growth was an illusion. He argued that we must take a broad and many-sided approach to development. And he starts from the concept of development as freedom. For him, development is a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy. And this broad process embraces all narrower views of development, such as the growth of individual incomes, facilities for education and healthcare, civil rights, technological progress, and social modernization. Freedom is central to the process of development for two distinct but complementary reasons. Increasing freedom is the measure of development, and free people are the drivers of development. This broad approach to development gives a vital role to education, even if the expansion of schooling in a particular jurisdiction does not give an immediate economic payoff. And the history of Japan shows that universal education should be seen as a basis for economic development rather than its cause. Japan greatly increased education and healthcare before it broke out of poverty. But when other factors were favorable for economic growth, the good levels of education and literacy allowed Japan to develop rapidly. And in another example, once China had adopted a form of market economics, it grew more rapidly than India because it already had higher levels of education and healthcare. So considering development as freedom makes education a component of development as well as a means of promoting it. Education fosters some freedoms directly, and since freedoms strengthen each other, it has a knock-on effect that promotes development generally. And the notion of free people as the drivers of development also helps to change the concept of the development from a process that is imposed on people by governments and development agencies to something that they do for themselves. And Amartya Sen illustrates this by pointing out that because of its strong emphasis on women's education, the birth rate in the Indian state of Kerala has fallen faster than it has in China, even with China's coercive one-child policy. And educating women is a perfect example of education being a constituent of development, since its effect in reducing both fertility and infant mortality has been widely demonstrated. Indeed, the education of girls may well be the most powerful tool against climate change. That's because since the Industrial Revolution, the world's population has grown by a factor of 7, and each person's impact on the environment is now, on average, 7 times greater. This means that the impact of the human population on the planet has grown by a factor of almost 50, and curbing the population growth is the fastest way to reduce it. Let me now recount briefly the story of the global campaign to achieve education for all, a campaign in which I was centrally involved during my years as head of the education sector at Unesco from 2001 to 2004. Nations came to aspire to education for all at different times and in different ways. In Japan, for example, modernization started when the country opened its doors to the West in 1867 in the Meiji Restoration. The national goal was to build a rich country and a strong army, and the main objective of the Education Act of 1872 was to provide education for everybody, regardless of status and gender, so that the whole population would be able to enjoy happiness and prosperity equally. And the Act stated, quote, "Learning is the key to success in life, and no man can afford to neglect it. Everyone should subordinate all other matters to the education of his children. Henceforth, throughout the land, without distinction of class and sex, in no village shall there be a house without learning, and in no house an ignorant person." Across the Pacific, in the United States, the first compulsory school attendance act was passed by Massachusetts in 1852. However, this state had already legislated on education 200 years earlier, and the Massachusetts Act of 1642 placed on parents the responsibility for their children's basic education and literacy. Government officials were there to see that all children and servants could demonstrate competency in reading and writing. And all this reflected the view that in a heterogeneous society, the masses had to be educated in order to understand the written codes of the governing laws and documents of a new country. In Europe, legislation on education came later. Compulsory education was enacted in Britain in 1880 and free education in France in 1881. But of course, legislation is only a first step. In all these countries, the extent and quality of education have repeatedly returned as political concerns right up to the present day. And President Obama's very significant speech yesterday shows that he's wanting to jump in too. But at the international level, I take up the story in 1990 when 4 agencies of the UN system convened the World Conference on Education for All in Jomtien, Thailand. The conference was convened because in 1985, some 105 million children aged between 6 and 11 were not in school, the majority of them girls. And forecasts suggested that the number of out-of-school children might double to 200 million by the year 2000. The purpose of the Jomtien Conference was to stimulate international commitment to a new and broader vision of basic education, to meet the basic learning needs of all, to equip people with the knowledge, skills, values and attitudes that they need to live in dignity, to continue learning and to contribute to the development of their communities and nations. And of course it was on that impetus that the Delors report and the 4 pillars of learning were developed. The outcome of Jomtien was a series of 6 targets adopted by 155 governments, 33 intergovernmental bodies, and 125 non-governmental organizations that were to be reached by the year 2000. And the targets addressed, in summary, the expansion of early childhood care, the universal completion of primary education, improvement in learning achievement, and there were some targets attached to that, the reduction of adult literacy, expanded training in essential skills for youth and adults, and general education for sustainable development. They set up an international consultative forum for education to all to monitor and promote progress towards these targets. And it organized various events, including in 1993, a summit of the 9 highest population developing countries, which the UN system calls the E9, and a mid-decade meeting to assess progress, with regional meetings to report on country assessments that had been commissioned. So a serious effort was made, but despite these efforts, the targets were not achieved. Indeed, in absolute terms, the world actually went backwards. In 1990, 100 million children aged 6 to 11 were not in school, and by 2000, this number had grown to 125 million. So why was Jomtien such an embarrassing failure? Why were the participants in the Jomtien conference, in the words of one critic, as ineffectual as they were well-meaning? Those who'd set the Jomtien targets put much of the blame of the failure to achieve them on 6 major changes that had impacted on education during the 1990s. First was population growth, notably an increase of 25% in the number of 6 to 14-year-olds in Africa, which moved the goalposts out of reach. Many countries were afflicted by conflict and natural disasters. HIV/AIDS began to reverse the development gains of previous decades and had particularly dire effects on education systems as children became AIDS orphans and teachers died. Fourth, because of the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, education systems that had previously provided relatively complete coverage had been broken up. There were major economic crises in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe, which may, of course, have been exacerbated by the development policies of the West. And finally, the exponential rise in communication technologies created a digital divide that further increased the disparities between developed and developing countries. So the World Bank concluded that these 6 developments of the 1990s impacted strongly on education and have forced a fundamental rethinking of EFA. EFA can no longer be attained through business as usual with the usual players. But despite this statement, the international community did appear to pursue business as usual by convening another World Forum on Education for All in Dakar in 2000. It was convened by the same intergovernmental organizations and attracted over 1,000 participants from 164 countries. Once again, a set of 6 targets were agreed, very similar to those at Jomtien, with 2015 as the deadline for achieving the quantitative ones. Now, the World Bank expected to be given the responsibility for leading this new post-Dakar campaign for EFA, but in the event, the Framework for Action called on UNESCO to coordinate global efforts. And later in 2000, however, the world's heads of government met at the United Nations and approved the Millennium Declaration with a list of 8 Millennium Development Goals. And these picked up, in summary form, 2 of the Dakar EFA goals. The first, to achieve universal primary education, to ensure that by 2015, children everywhere, boys and girls alike, will be able to complete a full course of primary schooling, and to promote gender equality and empower women, to eliminate gender disparity in primary and secondary education, preferably by 2005, and at all levels by 2015. And the World Bank, which was given the key role in driving forward the wider campaign to achieve all these Millennium Development Goals, subsequently focused most of its work in education on these two goals. And from then on, the World Bank tended to use the term EFA to refer more narrowly to universal primary education rather than to the broader agenda articulated at Dakar. After a few false starts, the World Bank began bringing the international donors together to support the Universal Primary Education, UPE, campaign under what was called the Fast Track Initiative, although some ministers from developing countries were heard to mutter that juxtaposing the words fast and World Bank created an oxymoron. The aim of the FTI was to provide concentrated support to complete the task of achieving the quantifiable EFA goals in countries where conditions were judged to be propitious. And a first group of 18 low-income and low-enrollment countries were selected as participants for early external assistance. The three goals of the FTI were a deeper commitment to education policy reform and the efficient use of resources in developing countries, increased and better coordinated aid from industrialized countries, and improved assessment based on better data. The FTI did inject a sense of urgency into the support for the UPE campaign, although some potential recipient countries felt that the definition of propitious conditions, meaning domestic policy reform, was too stringent. And a 2002 report identified 28 countries at risk of not achieving the three quantifiable EFA goals, yet only 6 were on the FTI list. Now, this kind of international intervention in education and in national education systems generates many ethical issues, and the responses to them can lead us in different directions. Donor countries, and the United States is particularly obsessive about this, often want to supervise the spending of the money themselves, allegedly so that they can provide reassurance to their taxpayers. But this can preclude the sensible pooling of donor contributions to achieve greater effect, and also leads to the ludicrous situation where the hard-pressed Tanzanian civil servants have to provide some 1,400 reports per year to different donors. The British, who have supported some sensible approaches to aid, prefer to give their funds as budget support, simply injecting them into the treasury of the country with the proviso that they be used for declared educational goals. But this, of course, moves the ethical challenge to the recipient country. Might it then move the national resources that it would otherwise have spent on education into the defence budget, for example? The World Bank's core issue is cost effectiveness, and it likes to see the research results of its many economists translated into policy. For example, the economists at the World Bank came up with what they considered was the optimum salary band for teachers in African countries and made this a guideline for countries receiving assistance. But imagine being a Minister of Education in an African country and being told that a condition of support is that you have to reduce the salaries of all your teachers by 30%. It was hardly practical politics. So other donors worried whether the World Bank, which wanted countries to follow strict guidelines like this, would accept the judgments of in-country donor groups that a national education sector was good enough to justify FTI funding. So these are the questions of trust inherent in international collaboration. But despite all this, by 2004, the Fast Track Initiative was gaining ground. 17 donors had pledged 1.3 billion for the period 2004-2011, although it has to be said that most of this came from the Netherlands, the UK, the European Commission and Spain. And there was a similar concentration in recipient countries, with large grants to only 5 countries and 13 others receiving less than 10 million. And today, in 2009, it appears that many countries will still fail to achieve universal primary education by 2015. There's a shortfall of $1 billion in funding looming, and if such deficits materialize, some countries currently receiving support may see aid flows interrupted, and others will get no support at all. My purpose in summarizing the history of EFA is to show that despite the good intentions expressed at the EFA conferences, securing adequate donor support and even collecting on the pledges made is not straightforward. The campaign to achieve universal primary education has been a long and difficult struggle, and despite all the efforts and international arm twisting, some countries may still not make it by 2015. But let's now take a bird's eye view and summarize the successes and failures of the campaign to achieve universal primary education before I conclude with some comments about their implications. The success, and I think we can all be proud of this, is that substantial progress has been made in getting children into primary school. The numbers in primary school have increased much faster since 2000 than in the decade between Jomtien and Dakar. The average net enrollment rate rose from 54% to 70% between 1999 and 2006 in sub-Saharan Africa, and from 75% to 86% in South and West Asia. So in sum, there were 40 million more children in developing countries in school in 2006 than in 1999. And this success generates the first challenge. What opportunities will these children have to continue their schooling if they complete primary school, and of course, even if they do not? Because, of course, parents realize that while primary education is the basis, it is secondary that will actually deliver an increased life chance and lifestyle. But the obverse of the coin, the failure, was that in 2006, 75 million children, 55% of them girls, were not in primary school. And furthermore, on present trends, there will still be some 29 million children out of school by 2015, which of course is a number almost equivalent to the population of Canada. And this is a second challenge: what can be done to bring schooling to these youngsters? Let me take the challenge of success first. The success of the campaign for universal primary education is creating a surge of children towards secondary schooling, and there is nowhere for most of them to go. Given the vagaries of the campaign for universal primary education, not to mention the current economic downturn, it is extremely unlikely that international development and the donor community would sign up for and organize a campaign for universal secondary education. So in expanding secondary education, countries are likely to be left largely to their own devices, and many will find the task well nigh impossible unless the cost of quality secondary education can be drastically reduced by using alternative methods. And this is the context in which the Commonwealth of Learning is helping to promote and expand the practice of open schooling in developing countries. Of course, the use of open and distance learning at the secondary level is not new. In Canada, it goes back almost a century. But in our country, this has been a small-scale affair, aimed, for instance, at children in very rural areas or with disabilities. What the developing world now needs is open schooling at scale, and there are already some impressive examples. The National Institute for Open Schooling in India enrolls 300,000 pupils a year, and alongside it there are 10 state open schools serving India in the local languages, and it is both effective and cost-effective. Namibia and Botswana are two other countries that have open schools operating effectively at scale. The Namibian College of Open Learning is the largest educational institution in the country, and its 25,000 pupils account for 40% of all secondary enrolments. And in a spirit of South-South cooperation, the Commonwealth of Learning is helping to share expertise between India and Africa. We consider that coping with the secondary surge will be the world's biggest educational challenge in the next decades, and it cannot be solved by conventional means. Countries that fail to achieve universal primary education are in a similar predicament when it comes to formulating a response. Getting the remaining 75 million children, twice the population of Canada, into school will require various strategies, but above all, the employment of more teachers. In my view, open schooling is not appropriate at the primary level in general because children need teachers present in a class with them. But the figures are daunting. Worldwide, 18 million new teachers will be required by 2015, because this is not just a developing world problem. Only, you might say, 3.8 million of those 18 million will be required in Africa, but in Africa, many millions of untrained teachers already in post will need extra training. And this is another challenge that cannot be met by conventional approaches. The hard-pressed teacher education institutions in developing countries cannot produce new teachers on this scale by bumping up enrolments a little and packing more trainee teachers into each class. But again, fortunately, Canada, among other countries, has already shown the way by using open and distance learning in teacher training. Indeed, in the 1970s, I was part of a team at the Université du Québec's Téléuniversité that used distance learning to reach all the secondary teachers in the province, first for training in what was then called the new mathematics, and later for training in the teaching of French. The system worked very well, and I like to think that Quebec's impressive performance in the OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment owes something to the foundations that we laid 30 years ago in training teachers in the new mathematics. So I shall conclude there. After examining why increasing importance has been given to the aspiration for education for all in recent centuries, I've summarized the 20-year campaign to achieve it that began with the Jomtien Conference in 1990. It hasn't been easy, but thanks to great efforts at the national level in developing countries and significant support by some of the richer countries, the pattern of primary schooling has been transformed. But success creates new challenges. As more children complete primary school, the demand for secondary education will skyrocket, and many governments will be unable to meet it without radically different approaches to schooling. In some countries, the challenge is the failure to achieve universal primary education. Converting failure to success is largely a matter of getting more and better teachers into the classrooms. And here again, conventional approaches to teacher training are not up to the task, and different strategies may be employed. So this is the context for two of the most important programs of the Commonwealth of Learning. And I would like you to feel proud that Canada is host at the other end of the country to a small intergovernmental agency of the Commonwealth that is helping countries to address both of these crucial issues. Let us hope that before 2 more decades have elapsed, we may be able to tick that box and say that education for all is a global reality. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much for a marvellous presentation. Some rather sobering statistics in there. I can't help but be particularly struck by the data you presented about the lack of schooling for girls. And clearly that's a challenge that we face in many parts of the world. We know that it's affected by culture, by religion, but I wonder if you might just talk a little bit further about what you think the particular challenges are, not only of getting more and more children to have universal primary education, but particularly the situation in which girls find themselves. It's somewhat ironic here in Canada. We're often bemoaning what is happening to the young men who seem to be dropping out of educational programs or doing other things, and yet there are parts of the world where a girl can simply not get any education. So if you had some further comments on that, that would be appreciated.
Thank you. Yes, the whole question of gender equity and gender equality is becoming quite complicated because in front of certain audiences, as you've implied, if you put the stress on girls, people leap down your throat and tell you that is not the problem. Certainly in the Caribbean, it is not the problem. In large parts of Southern Africa, it is not the problem. And as you go further up the educational ladder, in almost all countries nowadays, girls are massively more present and more performing than boys. I was very marked a couple of years ago by being present at a graduation ceremony at the University of Technology, Jamaica. Now, part of the received wisdom is that girls tend to avoid technology and engineering and those things. At that ceremony, every single prize was won by a woman, and watching them go over the stage, I would estimate that 9 out of 10 of all the first-class degrees were won by women, and this was in a University of Technology in the Caribbean. So there is obviously substantial progress towards solving that problem. However, it is true that the education of girls at the basic level is still a great challenge in large parts of Africa and in large parts of West and South Asia. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that parents are reluctant to send their girls to school. Now, some of those reasons you can do a limited amount about, and that's because they expect the girls to help at home with the domestic chores. But some one can, and it is being addressed. First of all, it's, I think, very well shown that if there are no role models for girls in the classroom, that is bad news. In other words, parents don't want to send their girls to schools in Africa or Asia where there are nothing but male teachers. So balancing up the teaching force is a problem. And I think it's very difficult to pin down exactly what the boy problem is in the Caribbean, but some say that the feminization of the teaching force hasn't helped because they're not seeing male role models in the classroom. And some other very basic things. Fencing schools is something that reassures parents, particularly about sending their girls to school, and obviously having latrines and toilets. I mean, this sounds very basic, but many countries in the developing world don't have running water in their schools, and so you have to deal with these very material, basic issues. But this is now, I mean, people know now how to do it, and I think a remarkable job has been done in convincing heads of state, particularly again in Africa, of the importance of this issue. I mean, I think it is now, people know that educating girls is the single strongest thing you can probably do for development. And so, since there is a lot of experience, UNICEF has played a very important role in developing the sort of received wisdom on girl-friendly schools and dealing with that. So it is happening. But of course, no sooner have you solved one problem than you've got another. These girls are now going to sail through university and get first-class degrees. Meanwhile, as Obama was lamenting yesterday, there are parts of the United States where the dropout rate from high school is 40%. And these are massively boys rather than girls. So, and this actually it was very interesting. Towards the end of my time at UNESCO, one of the good things that we did during that time was to produce every year a very serious and very well-researched global monitoring report on education for all. And what this did, each year it would take one of the goals and do a really thorough study, whether it was literacy or early childhood, whatever, and it would do a general review of how things were going. And these global monitoring reports, we suddenly started to find about 2004 that countries which previously had ticked the box of gender equality were no longer there. One was Britain, one was Sweden, of all places. And this was because their dropout rates of boys in secondary school were becoming such that you could not say that there was gender equality in the final years of secondary school. So it's a very difficult problem, and it would be very interesting to see how the US deals with it. Because certainly, I don't know if any of you've seen reports of Obama's speech yesterday, but he was really pretty courageous. He took on some of the shibboleths in his own party about teacher pay and charter schools and so on, and clearly there's a determination to do something about it, but it's not a simple problem by any means.
Hi. It's been a very good journey through the Gutenberg galaxy. I'm reminded of Mark Twain admonishing people to not let schooling interfere with their education. I'm reminded of a scene in Out of Africa, Robert Redford, Meryl Streep, where she builds a school to school the children of the native people. And Robert Redford's character says, "What a terrible, bold presumption of you to think that they don't have an education. You just want to make Englishmen out of them." Last August 15th, for the first time in the history of the planet, half of humanity lived in cities. And most of them knew a poverty that was impossible to know on the countryside. There has been all kinds of wonderful educating going on in spite of schooling all over the world up until now. And unfortunately, what a lot of children are learning, and a lot of people are learning, is that there's a great price for living within this Gutenberg galaxy that Marshall McLuhan used to speak about all the time and warn us about. We wonder why we're failing and our progress is so minute in educating the world's children. But then one doesn't wonder too long about that when you see what the price of one nuclear submarine is, and that it would clothe and educate and house every child in probably the world for a whole year. I applaud your efforts and your concern, and don't dote for a moment that you're a good person. But I wonder sometimes if, considering how calamitous our world has become, we ought to start asking a whole lot more questions than we've dared to ask so far. And I think here at a university it would be most appropriate. I just wonder what you think about these things I've been mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I share your concern, and I made the comment that some of the problems that were alleged to have slowed down, prevented the achievement of the Jomtien targets were the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank, which were destroying things that were perfectly good. But, you know, having gone through all that, I still find it difficult to argue that one solution would be to stop educating people. There's all kinds of things to be said about that they're being given the wrong education. And I travel a lot in the Commonwealth, and it's amazing how the old colonial curriculum is still much more alive and in better health in many of those countries than it is in the countries that originated. I mean, you see the kiddies going to school in their uniforms and everything, and doing their Shakespeare courses, and it's really quite a throwback. But that is changing, and things are becoming more attuned, one says, to the needs of what the people have. But and one of the interesting questions, and I mean to come back to what we're trying to do at the Commonwealth of Learning, if you are spreading open schooling, you have a chance to actually try and address some of these issues by teaching a different curriculum. And for example, I mean, it's I think quite clear that the Western paradigm of a very sharp distinction between formal and non-formal education does not correspond to the reality of people in the developing world. And so one of the advantages of open schooling is that the people who come to you are not just secondary age children, they are young adults who had a very checkered schooling, they're adults who didn't have much schooling, they're children who are on the streets, they're this, they're that, they're all kinds of things. So one has to develop a much more flexible and a much more responsive sort of form of education for them. But I mean, the parents in these countries want their children educated. They are, in fact, to some extent, one of the obstacles, because if they've gamed the system, if they feel that this was good for them when they were going to school, so that, don't change it because I want my kid to get what I got, even if it's demonstrable that what they were given was very much a training for work in a white-collar job in a colonial civil service which no longer exists, and so on and so forth. So there are some very difficult questions about what it is that one should be teaching. But I think that the quote I started with from Adam Smith has some merit to it, that people are less likely to be hoodwinked if they have some ability to make judgments for themselves. So therefore that I don't apologize for promoting education for all, but at the same time, I think there's enough evidence it's not going to lead us to a world that may be much better, but will hopefully turn things around. I mean, you mentioned the history of Nova Scotia. I mean, it seems to me Nova Scotia is quite a good advertisement for all the things that were done from 1836 onwards. I mean, you live it's a pity that the world is screwed up around you, but as far as Nova Scotia is concerned, it's not a bad record. And many countries would envy that.
I have much simpler questions to ask you. There was something you said during your speech I just wanted to follow up on. You said that in 2000 there was 125 million children not in school. I wonder if you'd break that down and be more precise about where they were. I'm just curious as to where those children are who are not in school in 2000. And you referred to President Obama's speech yesterday, and I was astonished to read in his speech that in America over the past 30 years, he said the dropout rate had tripled. I wasn't aware of that phenomenon at all. Is there anything about that explains that? And is that a phenomenon that's widespread, or is it unique to America?
You're getting me outside my area of expertise, but to take the last part first, I think America's got it worse than most others, but I think you'd find it's a phenomenon throughout the industrialized West. I mentioned that we suddenly discovered halfway through this decade that Britain was no longer claiming gender equality at secondary level because of the dropout rate having increased among boys. There must be people in this room who know the statistics for Canada better than I do, but certainly it was something that we lamented when I was living in Ontario, that this was happening in a big way. And in fact, I lived this when I was at Laurentian University, because this serves the large territory of northeastern Ontario, and that had been a place where boys with relatively little training, not even perhaps having finished high school, could go out and get really well-paid jobs either in the mines or in the forestry industry. And suddenly these industries changed. And obviously the forestry companies weren't about to let someone who couldn't read loose on $1 million piece of machinery. And so suddenly that whole society in Northern Ontario, I'm thinking particularly right up in the Hudson's Bay lowlands, it was transformed because the boys really were no longer playing their roles, and it was the girls who came forward and got educated and took the jobs and so on. And I'm sure some of that goes on here too. So I don't think it's limited to the United States, but I think in the United States it's been particularly bad, perhaps because of the huge disparities that have grown up between their good and their bad schools and the inner city schools and all these sorts of things. I think that's part of it. But I mean, it's the States obviously has particular problems. This oft-cited figure that there are more blacks in prison than in college is another example of it. To your first question, broadly speaking, you're talking South Asia and Africa for the large majority of these 120 million. And at the moment, I think if you take India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Brazil, and possibly toss in Bangladesh, you're accounting for something like 80% of the children not in school. So, and India, to its credit, is really cracking the problem. I mean, they are really working on this big time. I think the biggest disaster at the moment is Nigeria, which doesn't seem to get any traction on it at all. But as I say, progress this decade has been a lot faster than it was before. So there is, if you believe it's a good objective, there is hope that it's being reached. Please.
Our fastest growing population in Canada are the Aboriginal First Nations. Can you comment on what we have to do to make sure that they will feel included and have the education that they need?
Yeah, again, this is not an area that I know a great deal about. In fact, what I know about it has come partly from being a member of the board of Paul Capon's Canadian Council on Learning. And I think it's to the credit of that body that it really has made a bit of a go at this, creating the Centre for Aboriginal Learning. And I think giving the First Nations people quite a powerful tool to get a grip on things themselves. We at the Commonwealth of Learning do not generally work in the industrialised countries that are some of our major supporters, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. But we've often been approached to say, well, the dynamics, the challenges in the First Nations communities of Canada are not dissimilar to what you meet in the rest of the world. Couldn't you sort of do something about that? We've taken that very gingerly because obviously it's politically quite sensitive given the different jurisdictions, federal, provincial, and so on. But we have had some discussions with them. I think it's a very similar challenge to some of the ones that were just referred to in the United States. I mean, it's not a single issue of education. It's an issue of social justice and inequality, and one thing builds on another. I was listening yesterday to a very interesting talk in New York by a guy called Jeffrey Canada, who for 25 years has been running an educational initiative, if you like, in Harlem. And one of the points he made was that one of the bugbears of this is that people come in with a sort of solution for one aspect of the problem, be it teenage mothers or drugs or this and that. And he'd come to the conclusion after 25 years that you'd got to tackle it on a broad front and you'd got to start early. Time and again, this was a meeting on global education run by the Economist yesterday in New York. It was mostly about American education, I have to say. But one of the really things that came through very strongly was the absolute importance of early childhood education and the evidence that if you really got that to work, so that kids went into the first formal years of education up to speed, made a huge difference. Because he made the point that in Harlem, some of these kids, when they hit school, they were several years behind the other kids, even at age sort of 6. And that gap never gets caught up. So he was arguing, and I think this probably carries for the First Nations communities. It's a multifaceted problem, but it has to be, to the extent that the educational answer to it has to begin at a very, very early age with early childhood education, and then preparing them so that when they get into the education system, they can keep up, and then making sure that they keep up. Instant attention to children who seem to be falling behind so that they don't fall behind. And that seems to be the sort of conclusion that people are reaching.
Sir John, thank you very much for your presentation. I really found it quite enlightening because you took such a global perspective. Much of the focus seemed to be on trying to expand the scope of universal primary education. And I wanted to ask you if that automatically translates into higher literacy rates and more useful knowledge. Is there a direct relationship? Is that the ultimate goal? It seemed to me that the focus was almost exclusively on just increasing participation rates. So I'd like your comment on that. What are the ultimate results of expanding universal primary education? And secondly, another question is, you, in passing, referenced the digital divide. And I haven't read much about it lately. I'd be interested in your comments on whether that has increased the gap in educational achievement in the world, or whether it's narrowing the gap.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I feel embarrassed now to mention the World Bank, but any development agency, I mean, any government agency has to sort of work with the adage that more than 3 objectives is no objectives. And that was why I think the bank quite rightly decided that rather than try and chase all the goals of EFA at once, they'd focus on universal primary. In fact, the developing countries themselves, I gather, at Dakar said, if you're smart, you'll stay away from the quicksands of literacy, because there are 600 million adult literates in the world, and you're never going to crack that problem. So, just let that wither on the vine. No, I think that obviously the idea is that by achieving universal primary education, you will create a generation of kids who come out being numerate and literate to a degree that they can build on for the rest of their lives, and hopefully the other good things like learning to do, learning to be, learning to know, and learning to live together. The problem is that there's a sort of constant catch-22, because the more successful you are at getting enrollments up, the chances are you've then got to immediately worry about the quality of what you're doing. Some countries, Malawi, Kenya, abolished all fees for primary education. And overnight, the numbers of kids coming to school doubled without any commensurate increase in buildings or teachers. So not surprisingly, I mean, you have teachers in front of classes of 120. I heard of one the other day where they were in front of a class of 200 kids. Obviously, the quality tends then to slide, and the parents aren't stupid. I mean, they see that nothing is happening, they will tend then not to send the kids to school. So the countries have to keep iterating through more access and more quality and more teachers and so on and so forth. But yes, obviously the aim is not just to, if you like, incarcerate these kids in primary school for a number of years. It is that they come out prepared to do something, and that's something that the agencies, the countries, are now assessing much more carefully, and are a bit dismayed by some of the results to find that the even the children who have completed primary school aren't performing at the level that is hoped for. But I think the feedback loop is working, and it is gradually getting better. The digital divide. How should I put this? I don't actually think it is making the gap bigger. And that's partly because I think, by and large, the rich industrialized countries have made a complete sow's ear of their introduction of computers into schools. So it hasn't actually improved much there. So there's no gap really to be widened. And I mean, one mustn't make a sort of cause and effect in too facile a way, but it is interesting that the country with the most emphasis on computers in schools, namely the US, has been slipping gradually down the league tables of reading, scientific and math competency. I don't see this as a correlation, but it's an interesting fact. It's quite interesting actually to see that some of the developing countries, because they have less resource, have what is being demonstrated as a more sensible approach to the use of such computers as there are. It's very interesting to compare two projects, one which originated out of MIT through Negroponte called the One Laptop Per Child project, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. They designed this laptop with sort of green antenna and everything, and the idea was that if every kid in the world had one of these things, the problem would be solved. It suffers from not having been, oddly enough, for an American project, not having been evaluated very seriously. But certainly people are voting with their feet. I mean, the sales of this thing haven't been all that great, and I think they've scaled down the number of people working on it and so on. Contrast that to a project which fewer of you may have heard of, but some of you will, called the Hole in the Wall. Anyone heard of the Hole in the Wall project? Google it. It's fascinating. I'll tell you the story of the Hole in the Wall. This is a brilliant guy called Sugata Mitra, who was working for India's National Institute of Information Technology, which is a very large teacher of IT around India and the world. And these people, as often happens in India, are in a nice green campus with nice buildings and a big wall around it, and all around them is a slum. So Mitra one day thought it'd be interesting to see how, if we can't get a little technology transfer. So he took a computer and cemented it into the wall on the other side of the campus, in other words, the wall facing the slum, with a touch screen and so on. And he put a video camera across the street and just watched what happened. And in a week, the kids were dragging and dropping and doing many of the computer operations. In 2 weeks, they'd found how to get music, and the whole thing was going like gangbusters. These kids had no one teaching them. They had no English, and everyone said it was impossible. There must be a trick somewhere. So he put more of these things in different parts of India where it's absolutely sure that there was no one who could possibly be teaching them and coaching them. And I mean, this goes back now a number of years and is continuing to roll on. And it's clear that children can teach themselves not just IT, but a considerable number of other things if given the equipment, and particularly if made to work together. I mean, Mitra thinks that one laptop per child is absolutely not what you should do. You should have one laptop per 4 children, because it's by working together that they do it. And in fact, he did some studies on this, and he gave them the challenge of learning something about biotechnology. And remember, these are kids who have no English to start with, but he pointed them a bit in the direction of what they should be looking at on the web and so on, and said he'd come back and ask them some questions in a month's time. And one of the questions he asked them was, could you have done this individually? They said, absolutely not. No, we worked on it together. We helped each other. And some interesting things happened in some of these villages where they had the computer in a kind of kiosk, and he designed it cleverly so that it was almost impossible for an adult to use it without getting cramps, because it was quite low and there was a bar over it and so on. So the adults sort of stayed away. But because the kids were working on it collectively, the particular talents of different children came to the fore, and particularly the girls was shown that they would say, you actually do that and it works, and it did. So there became a slightly different respect across the gender divide in the villages. I mean, that's just one example. It has now been reproduced in many countries of the world. But it's an example that if you start with, if you like, the problem and just try and work through and see what happens experimentally, some good things can happen. But I think it's clear that you have to start with what is the issue rather than just thinking that technology will solve it without thinking through exactly how it's going to do it.
I don't want to take issue with the previous question asker, but I thought the focus, the global focus and the broad spectrum of your comments worked against helping us understand things that are going on. The countries you're talking about are very different, one to another. The conditions, the history. The first questioner asked about this. I can imagine that there are some countries where the problem is supplying the demand. The demand is already there. I mean, the parents want their kids to go to school and to learn a formal curriculum. And the task then is to meet that demand. I imagine there are other countries where parents are not happy about this. And we have to ask the question, well, ought we be trying to create a demand here? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe the parents don't know what's best for their children in conditions that are coming. But then how do we do that appropriately with appropriate respect for family structures and community structures and the rest? It might be the case, I'm sure it is in some countries, that there's a non-democratic government that wants this. And maybe that non-democratic government is right, maybe not, but the fact that it's a non-democratic government means that it lacks legitimacy in the first place to bring this in with children. I want those children and their parents who want primary education to have it, and those children for whom it would definitely be a good thing, given what they can expect economically, socially, politically in their country, to have it, or at least have the opportunity. But the idea that education is good in itself for all children, education, the formal education that you're talking about, that seems problematic. So I would like to see case studies of particular places, what these particular countries are looking for, what they need, what the parents want, the government, and then how donor agencies, developed nations can help with those particular conditions and those particular situations.
Yes, I mean, donor agencies can only help if the country wants it. I mean, I'll get to your question whether the parents want it, but if a country is not interested, then obviously there's no traction and no one's going to force their way in. As I said, the funds available on this fast-track initiative to take that were insufficient to meet the demand, even for those countries who were very keen to have it. But to go to the wider question, clearly there are social structures in which the education of particularly girls was seen as not a good thing. Now, what does one do about that? Should one do anything? I think that the general exposure, if you like, to the world of communication has changed that quite substantially. In the course of the last 10 years, the attitude of Pakistani parents to the education of their daughters has changed radically, because I guess that not long ago they kind of accepted that education wasn't for girls, and now a very large number of them do. What has changed this? I mean, to go to the other side of that continent, in Bangladesh, I think what has changed things is to discover that educated girls had a much greater economic value. as from the things we were talking about earlier, that as the workplace changes and as the opportunities change, in Bangladesh, many of the people who are getting these microfinance loans and launching small enterprise in the villages are women. And so suddenly, whereas parents didn't see much of an economic value in their daughters, therefore why invest further in it? They see that differently. I mean, my own personal experience after the Taliban were first sort of flushed out of Afghanistan at the end of 2001, the United Nations agencies went in, particularly UNICEF, but I was there sort of piggybacking in for UNESCO to recreate a school system, and particularly to create a school system that girls could go to, which the Taliban had completely banned. And it was just a fact that parents were very eager to get their kids, including their girls, to go to school if they could do it safely without risk of being sort of beaten up and so on by the Taliban. So I think there are very few countries in the world where, given a free choice, parents would not want to see their children educated. How that feeds through to the government deciding that it wants to make this a national campaign is rather another issue. And then whether that feeds through to getting any substantial help from donors is another issue again. And I mean, some countries have decided, the hell with the donors, we'll do it ourselves. India basically kicked out all the donors a few years back because, you know, they're now a country that's flexing its muscles and felt it could crack this problem itself, and is doing so. So they wanted to crack it in their way rather than have people at the bank telling them, you know, do it this way and not do it that way. But there are other countries which should be able to do that, but certainly aren't doing it yet. But I mean, Nigeria is a case in point where, in theory, there's all the resource necessary to do it, but not organised enough to get it to happen. But at the same time, the donors are a bit reluctant to touch Nigeria because they know there's so much money there anyway, and it just needs to be applied to real problems. I'm not sure I answered the question in the last part of it, but I mean, I've never met anyone who regretted being educated, so I'm very reluctant to argue that not being educated is a good thing for someone, because I've never found one.